My name is Jeff Gow. I'm the City of Dunedin Commissioner Representative to the PSTA Legislative Committee. I'd like to call this meeting to order. I would like to acknowledge that we currently do not have a quorum, so no votes can be taken at this time. So Brad, what else am I doing? Or anything that I should have said that I didn't say? Introduce ourselves.
Yes, I'm Brad Miller. I'm the CEO of PSTA.
Dave Albritton, representing Clearwater City Council.
Okay.
All righty. And at this time, is there any public comment?
There are no public comments.
All right. Being no public comment, we'll bring it back to the board. We will move past item 3, approving the minutes, since we do not have a quorum, and we can move on to information items, state legislative updates. Ron, how are you this morning, sir?
Good morning. Got it. There we go.
There you go.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. Thank you for the opportunity to be in person this morning versus being on virtual. Just a couple of things for you to share about our agenda, but before I get into that, I also want to share, session ended on March the 14th. If you're wondering, by the way, 285 bills passed in Tallahassee, which is a lot more than we expected considering committee weeks and the start of session got off to a relatively slow start. So ended up with 285 bills was a lot. If you're wondering what that translates to, just over 3,700 bills were filed in Tallahassee, nearly 1,900 amendments, 4,300 votes were taken, 39 floor sessions, which led to 285 bills. Record budget this year in Tallahassee, $112 billion, which is the largest state budget in our state's history. Last year was our largest budget at just over $100 billion, so almost with $12 billion in additional funding. A lot of that's non-recurring revenue. A lot of that was federal funding coupled with non-recurring general revenue, on revenue that was generated above and beyond spending from last fiscal year. Let's talk about our agenda. I think overall we had a really good, and I think transit overall had a really good, successful year in Tallahassee. So if you kind of walk through our agenda here, I'll kind of go through them in order. Number 1 was restoration of the transportation disadvantage innovative funds, which was included. There was $10 million last year that was not included in the budget. As I think we've talked about this a number of times in committee and also in board meetings. The Corridors bill eliminated $10 million for transportation disadvantage. They restored 6 of the $10 million this year. They didn't restore the full 10, but they did restore 6. $4 million went to the innovative grant funding, and then $2 million went to the overall allocation, which I think took the allocation for transportation disadvantage for the formula up to about $53 million. Brad, I haven't seen the final number, but I think what that translates to Pinellas County is, here in Pinellas, I think it's about $350,000 to $400,000 more than we received last year. So that is something that that was very positive for us. Rule 1490, the FDOD's transit rule, we actually were working with Senator Hooper and others on trying to get some language included in the transportation bill that was moving. There's good news and bad news there. The bad news is the transportation bill did not make it to the finish line. The good news is, which I think Brad would agree with, is by us just including the language and trying to kind of jumpstart that conversation, DOT has kind of jumpstart the rulemaking process on that. I think there's language that's coming out very soon that we have been told that PSTA is going to like. And more importantly, I think their plan from a rule making process is to try to get that done sooner rather than later. So I think that we'll have some success or probably over the summer. Hopefully we'll see that from FDOT. VW settlement funds for electric buses. There's really good news there, which is that $59 million was included for electric buses for transit agencies. That's something that we've worked on over the last couple of years, not only with the legislature and DEP, but also some of our other partners. So that's a big win for the transit industry. Again, it's $59 million that will be used for electric buses for transit organizations. If you flip over state transportation funding flexibility, there was a bill that was moving. It was the same transportation bill. The 1490 language was in for some additional funding for some flexibility for SIS funding. That did not make it to the finish line, but again, I think CIS funding, the DDR, the other arterials, plus the pre-award authority for DOT grants is something that we continue to work directly with DOT. DOT doesn't seem to think they need legislative authority to do some of these things. The CIS funding for flexibility for that, they've been working on that for the last couple of years, and I think that's already something that's kind of in place. They're kind of moving forward on. That's something that came out of COVID specifically to make sure that local governments and county governments have the ability specifically to have more flexibility in how to spend those dollars. Pinellas is a great example because on that CIS funding, when so much of the funding has to go directly towards roads, there's only so many roads we can continue to build in Pinellas County. So having the flexibility to maybe not have 75% of those funds, but lower that closer to 50% would allow us to spend more money on transit projects. So that's something we'll continue to work on. Medicaid, we continue to have conversations with the new Medicaid director about making sure that PSTA can get reimbursed for trips. That's something that we didn't want to address legislatively. Again, that's something that we feel we can probably get addressed from an executive branch standpoint. One final thing I want to bring up that's not on the agenda, but I know it's something very important to PSTA, and that is TBARTA did get funding in the budget this year for operations and for another project relating to transportation disadvantage. The most important thing to you all is, as from a PSTA perspective, is remember the last few years when TBARTA has received funding is through the Transportation Trust Fund, and the moment that happens is that impacts our funding, because what DOT will do is go in and say, okay, here's the complete pot for the transportation disadvantage or for the trust fund, and they'll actually take projects out of it to be able to fund what TBARTA was going to receive. The good news is for this year is moving forward, all those dollars that TBARTA is going to receive is non-recurring general revenue. It will not impact the Transportation Trust Fund in any way. So any dollars that are currently allocated for PSTA, HART, and any other transit agencies in the Tampa Bay area will not be impacted by TBARTA if they get funded when the final budget is approved. If you're wanting from a budget perspective, what we believe is special session is going to be next week for the congressional maps next Tuesday through Friday. We believe the budget will probably be released to the governor right after that. I would expect by the middle of May we'll know the budget will probably approve and do any vetoes at that point in time, but I suspect by mid-May we'll know where we are from a budget perspective moving forward. I'm happy to stop there and answer any questions from the committee members, and Brad, please let me know if I missed anything.
Are there any questions from the board?
Nope.
Maybe I can just add a couple things or ask Ron about a couple things. One, well, yeah, thank you very much, Ron, and RJ, for your great work during the session. Yeah, I agree. It was like one of our most successful sessions. I had hoped that we would hear by now, but maybe that was too optimistic to hear about any kind of movement on 1490. I don't think they have done anything yet. Still holding out hope, but we can keep it on the 2023 agenda if necessary.
And we'll follow up on that. I know they promised the summer, and we're in April, so we're approaching the summer. So what we'll do is RJ and I can follow up with DOT just to see where they are in that process. I know they were close on language. I know the last time that Brad, you and I talked to them in Tallahassee during a trip, they were pretty close. So we'll follow back up on that. Okay.
And then the VW settlement, VW's the deadline was yesterday, I think. We turned in our program. We're applying for $18 million, which is what we talked to the DEP when we were up there in Tallahassee about. We'll see. We'll see what the applications are from around the state on that. And then on the state funding flexibility item, so yes, I think you were right, Ron, that the CIS funding flexibility is moving forward, or maybe is in place. I heard that there was a slowdown, or I don't know if it requires legislative approval, and that didn't happen for the DDR funding flexibility. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, and I don't think it requires legislative authority. We talked to DOT about that. So with the new secretary in place, we'll circle back with his office and see if that's something they're going to work on, or maybe there's a change in mind there if they do believe they need some type of authority from the legislature. But I know during session they believe they did not.
Okay. And then on the T-BARTA funding, the PSDA is going to take the lead on putting in a innovative grant application, which I believe is due May 3rd, around early May. And we are going to be putting in, and we worked this out with the Commission for Transportation Disadvantage, that we would put in for the T-BARTA, the TD Tampa Bay regional service, our own Pinellas service, and Hillsborough has a late night service. We would submit a single application, like a Tampa Bay wide application for all these 3 different projects. And then I guess, since we may not know about the T-BARTA funding, if it survives gets in the ultimate budget that's approved by the due date, I'm assuming if it does, and if they have their funding otherwise, then the CTD will take it out of our application, I'm assuming, or I'm not exactly sure what will happen, but just to be safe, we'll go ahead and put it in on May 3rd.
Okay.
For that. And then finally on the Medicaid piece, I know that there's some movement on this. I think the state, there's some meetings coming up, I think. It's kind of complicated. They're getting some folks from the federal level to come down, I think, and talk to ACA, and the Florida Public Transit Association is kind of getting involved with that again. So good news on there. Yeah. RJ, is there anything that you would like to add?
Ron said it all.
Later this afternoon, I am on a transportation panel in
I'll be
Madeira
there.
Beach.
I'll be there.
Yes, since you represent a number of those cities over there. I guess there's
RJ can ask all the hard questions, it's perfect, so.
Yeah, I saw a thing that they're going to be talking. They're going to have someone from Brightline.
Yeah, I thought that was weird too.
Well, maybe we'll have Brightline go all the way to Madeira Beach. I don't know. Okay.
Thank you, Brad. Commissioner
Ron,
Albritton.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the ferry service money, because I'm going over this afternoon to Fort Pinellas, and
Oh yeah.
so how do we do on that? We got a note here, but
So we originally had it in there, not necessarily from a funding standpoint, but we wanted to make sure that ferry service would qualify as transit. And we met with DOT, we also met with Senate staff as well, and they believe that it does. If you follow the federal kind of definition, that ferry service would be specific, where you would allow transit operations or transit funding would be able to be included on that as well. So DOT kind of felt, and Brad, I think when we met with DOT, they said they've kind of felt that it would qualify under the definition for transit. So it wasn't a specific funding as much as just making sure that and really from an operations standpoint, it would qualify for operating dollars moving forward, or for existing grants within DOT. I think that was really the plan, the reason we had that in there, to make sure that from a grant standpoint, we could qualify for some of those in the future.
okay, all right, good, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the next item on the waterborne or the ferry program to-do list, I was talking to Whitland yesterday about it, is to get the discussions going with Pinellas County on the local funding. We will apply for a service development grant to help with funding some of the operating costs in the early years for what we call the restart plan for the Clearwater Ferry and the Cross Bay Ferry, and to start. So we'll see about that. And then ultimately, I think, as Harry can describe, we would apply for capital from the federal government for the ferry operations.
And Brad, did Hillsborough apply for dollars? I know that was something we were going back and forth last year about who was going to apply. And Hillsborough also put in dollars for the federal government. I don't want to swim into Harry's lane here, but I think Hillsborough did put in for dollars for the ferry service. Was that correct?
That was correct, and they were awarded, I can't remember how much.
20,
But enough, I think they're gonna be purchasing for the first time their own boat, their own ferry.
okay.
Yeah. So, yesterday at the St. Pete Chamber, the Ed Tranchek with the Cross Bay Ferry gave a presentation and said that there's a May 1st deadline for each of the member jurisdictions, Pinellas County, St. Petersburg, Hillsborough County, and Tampa, to renew their funding commitment for the Cross Bay Ferry. I don't know, that might come up at your Fort Pinellas meeting today.
Let's see.
So we'll see about that.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ron, very much for the presentation. Let's move on to federal legislative updates. Harry, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry I was late. Brad passed out, did you pass that to everybody? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just to check down on our federal priorities, and I can give you a little bit of a couple buckets here. First of all, item 3 is get the federal fiscal year 22 appropriations bill signed into law, which was done on March 11th finally. As I always joke with Ron, I think the state lapped the federal government again on getting their appropriations work done. But good news on the appropriations front, not only was the bill signed into law, but they sustained funding for all the programs that you would be interested in addition to the extra money that was provided in item 2, which was the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So we could talk about that a little bit. And then to add to that, I'll just kind of lump all these together because there's so many funding pots out there. We have the president's, at the end of March, released his fiscal year 23 appropriations or budget requests for the federal government. So if I can kind of maybe Brad, just dive in a little bit. All these funding opportunities kind of merge together, and maybe it might be helpful to you all, the committee, to give you an update on where some of these are. The PSTA does an excellent job at capturing all these funding opportunities. And I might note when Brad and your team were up in Washington last month, we learned that the bus and bus facility grant notice was made in Pinellas County. PSTA received the second largest grant in the country for that program. So that was good news. Brad was a star of the show at APTA conference in March. So that was great news. And that'll enhance your electric bus fleet. So that's great news. So right now, with the federal appropriations that were made available in the bill that was just signed into law, plus the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I know we're talking about the RAISE grant program. Congress appropriated this year $1 billion for the RAISE grant program. The bipartisan infrastructure bill provided another $2.5 billion for the RAISE grant program. What the administration has decided to do now, since both bills are in law, is to merge the funding sources together and create a $3.5 billion funding opportunity for the RAISE grant program. So
Wow.
I know Abhishek has been working diligently to get that proposal together and submitted. Brad, I had an email from Congressman Chris' office last night. They sent over a letter of support, then they wanted to take it back because there was a typo, so they're resending it this morning. So I don't know if Abhishek, if you've seen anything yet or not, but
No.
so as soon as we get that, we'll send that on to you, but we'll also make sure that that goes to the Secretary of Transportation. Congressman Bilirakis is working on a letter, as is Senator Rubio, so we will get that. Other thing of note on the RAISE grant, just as we're kind of merging all these conversations, the President's budget request for fiscal year 23 adds another $500 million to the RAISE grant. So he is requesting, instead of $1 billion this year, $1.5 billion next year in appropriated funds, plus the additional $2.5 billion from the infrastructure bill. As we recall, the infrastructure bill that Congress passed last year is a 5-year bill, and it provides funding, recurring funding over 5 years. So if that budget request and that bipartisan infrastructure money were merged together next year, then instead of being a $3.5 billion competitive opportunity, next year it would be a $4 billion competitive opportunity. So, 4 times larger than what you currently have. So lots of opportunities over the next 4 years. PSTA is doing an outstanding job with the RAISE grant application. And maybe just to dive back to RAISE grant, Brad, we had a good series of meetings in March when Brad was up with Commissioner Flowers and some of his staff. We met with folks from the U.S. Department of Transportation and with the Federal Transit Administration, as well as our congressional delegation, to talk about the project. We also, since I think our last meeting, Abhishek was on a phone call, we did a debrief with the Department of Transportation about the RAISE grant application last year that was not successful, and got a lot of good news on that call. The project last year was highly recommended, which is the highest recommendation you can get. In fact, the reviewer who was on the call with us told us, don't change a thing about the application, it was so good. The only thing they really wanted some work on was the benefit-cost ratio to try. There was confusion, I think, between their economists who reviewed the application and the folks who prepared your proposal, and it's a very complicated formula, but they wanted some clarification on the environmental benefits and how you score those, and the ridership benefits and how you score those. They gave Abhishek and your team some really good advice on that, so I think you're in really good shape going forward. The other thing, Brad and Commissioner Flowers did a really good job in Washington with the transportation folks at talking about how Pinellas County has never received a Tiger Bill RAISE grant, all the same competition, and they weren't aware of that. I think there's perception out there if they award a grant to Tampa that helps Pinellas County, and I think they're now more sensitized to the fact that while Pinellas and Tampa work together, Pinellas is not Tampa and Hillsborough County, and so that consideration needs to be given there. So I think they really primed the pump for that. I think hopefully we get good news on that RAISE grant. Going back to the budget request and funding opportunities, the infrastructure money is starting to roll out now, the bipartisan infrastructure money. In March, the Federal Transit Administration released a notice of funding opportunity for the bus and bus facilities grants program, which you were successful on last time, and the low-no bus program. So they've combined those applications into one. And so there's $372 million available this year for bus and bus facilities, and $1.1 billion available for low-no bus. So lots of, again, additional opportunities for PSTA to compete for those. They're due, I think, Abhishek, end of May is application deadline for those. Then we also have a list of upcoming notice of funding opportunities. They're rolling these out over the course of the year. You had a conversation, Brad, a little while ago about the ferry program, and we had a conversation in Washington about the ferry program that was in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The bipartisan infrastructure bill provided $50 million for a new program to allow transit agencies to purchase electric or low-emitting ferry boats. So that's a $50 million program for the next 5 years, so there'll be $50 million available. They expect that notice to come out in May. They also expect the competitive federal ferry grant program notice to come out in May also. This year, that's $112 million in appropriated funds, plus $68 million is in the infrastructure bill, so there'll be $180 million available for the ferry boat program, which is substantially more than I think typically the budget for that's about $30 to $35 million a year, so substantial new opportunities. Brad and I did learn in one of our meetings we had in Washington that there was a bit of a mix-up in the final bipartisan infrastructure bill and the ferry boat program. They created a new rural ferry boat program and funded it at $200 million a year, and they were supposed to, as we understand, have equity between the regular ferry boat program and the rural ferry boat program, but somehow the legislation did not reflect that, and so the rural ferry boat program will be funded at $200 million, and the bipartisan infrastructure funding for the regular ferry program is only 68. So they're working, I think, on try to get a fix for that. Brad, I don't know if they're going to be successful with that or not, but still at $180 million is a good opportunity for next year. The other thing, Brad, there's another program that they don't know when they're going to release it. It's called the Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Disabled program. It was a $50 million program that was created in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to help transit agencies provide more support for senior citizens and the disabled. So, Brad, I know in working with the Medicaid program and the other things that you're doing, this may be a good one to look at. We don't have a lot of information yet. The notice of funding opportunity is not out. It's not on the list of projected dates when it's going to come out, so it might be towards the end of the year, but we'll continue to monitor that. That'll be a $50 million program per year for the next 5 years, so we'll stay in touch with you on that. Also, as part of the budget situation, as you know, the transit agency receives formula funding from the Federal Transit Administration every year based on a whole variety of factors, including population, ridership, and other things. Between the gas tax, the highway authorization bill, and appropriated funds, in fiscal 21, the previous fiscal year, the total pot of formula grants was about $10 billion. In fiscal year 22, Congress appropriated and authorized from the trust fund $13.3 billion, which is a $3 billion increase. So Debbie, has just gotten, I believe, Brad, your allocations were released last month, so I'm sure, has an update can give an update at some later point to the board on where that comes from. The thing I want to note is the President's budget request for next year asks for another $300 million on top of that, so next year, the formula grant, if his budget was approved, would go from $13.3 billion to $13.6 billion. So the bigger the pot, obviously, the better that is for PSTA, because you receive your funds based on a formula. The other thing is, I don't think, Brad, you have anything in the pipeline immediately for the Capital Investment Grant Program. That's the program that funded the Sunrunner project, the Bus Rapid Transit project. It takes several years to get through the pipeline, as Abhishek well knows. But just to note, the Capital Investment Grant Program in fiscal 21 stood at $2 billion. And that's, I think, some of the funding you got came out of that pot. In fiscal 22, the current year, it's funded again at $2 billion plus another $1.6 billion add-on due to the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which moves the Capital Investment Grant Program to $3.6 billion. And the President next year is proposing another $800 million for the Capital Investment Grant Program. That's $2.8 billion plus $1.6 billion from the infrastructure bill. There'd be a total of $4.4 billion available for the Capital Investment Grant Program in fiscal 23 if that came to bear. So the point I wanted to make there is there's significant resources being made available over the next 5 years for transit programs. And so as you're looking at those, I know you guys are evaluating future potential CIG projects. So there will be large chunks of money for the next 4 years available. So I just call that to your attention. The other thing, Brad, just want to call to your attention too, in the President's budget, he proposes 3 new competitive programs for fiscal 23. Again, these would have to be approved by Congress, but 3 programs. One is $50 million for Zero Emission System Transformation Planning Program. That's a program that FTA would run to help transit agencies plan for the transition of their fleets to zero emission. I know you already are well down the path to do that, but there is planning money to do that, and that involves not just acquiring the buses, but all the infrastructure that has to go with the charging stations and all the things that we're going to talk about in a minute. Second is a $100 million discretionary competitive pot called the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Program. And what that program would do is help transit agencies modify their infrastructure to accommodate for climate change, sea level rise, make them more resilient. So some bus stations and other infrastructure find themselves in floodplains or in places where the weather is affecting them, and so it would be a competitive program. Again, this is a notional program. Congress still has to approve it next year, but it's something to think about, that there would be potentially a new program created to help you, and that would be huge here in Florida with climate resiliency. And the third program, which I think is right, I think Brad must have written this one for the President. It's a $50 million program called the Integrated Smart Mobility Pilot Program. This is a program that's along the lines of what you've already done, which is to create first mile, last mile service and other innovative ways to get riders to your system. And so, again, don't have a lot of details because it's a notional program being proposed by the President and the Secretary of Transportation. But we'll continue to track those. And Brad, it may be something worth talking to the delegation, particularly Mario Diaz-Balart and others, when you're up in next month to talk about the RAISE grant. As we meet with the delegation, we might want to just say, these programs all sound good to Florida and would be good competitive opportunities for you. So
good job, Brad, in running the language.
Yeah. So those are some good news for next year. As part of the appropriations process, as we've talked about before, Congress for the first time in 11 years brought back what they call Congressional Earmarking Program, which allows members of Congress to direct funding to nonprofit agencies, organizations within their district. Congressman Christ was very successful in securing $1.2 million for PSTA to help with your inline charger infrastructure. So that bill was signed into law in March. In the next couple of weeks, Brad, you'll be hearing, I'm sure, from FTA about how to access those dollars. So that's great news. And as part of the next budget cycle, we've been working together on another request to Congressman Christ for some infrastructure here at your headquarters facility to provide battery storage for solar electricity that's captured solar. And so I think Abhishek and I were just talking before the meeting that proposal is going to go into Congressman Christ today for consideration in the next appropriation cycle. So those funds wouldn't become available until next year, but it's a good opportunity. It's one, I think, that we did talk to Congressman Christ about, his staff about that when you were up in March. I think, Brad, that's, did I cover everything you wanted me to cover, Brad? We talked about
I think so. Maybe you want to just highlight our next visit to Washington DC?
Yeah, so we've talked about
Commissioner Albert?
coming up in mid-May to do another round of visits with the Department of Transportation to highlight your application and also to talk to the delegation, working with Congressman Christ on a phone call to the Secretary of Transportation this year to reiterate his support for the project. I think, Commissioner Albert, I understand you may be coming on that trip with
I got my
Commissioner
tickets.
Flowers, so that's great. So I look
Great.
forward to having you up there, and I think it'll be a good visit. I think Brad and Commissioner Flowers laid some good groundwork last month for that, so I think it'll be a good follow-up meeting for you. And like I said, we've heard,
Are we still asking for 15 million for the raise grant?
20.
20 now.
the
Okay,
max
so
is 25, and so
Yeah.
the ask is 20.
Okay.
Yeah, we submitted the raise grant last night. We did ask for 20 million for the
20. So,
$34
all right.
million project, yes.
Yeah, Abhishek, I was just thinking, maybe you could just quickly describe what's going on with the raise grant and the earmark requests. The Congressman Christ and the Congressman Bilirakis one, right, which we already turned in, right,
Correct.
Harry?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. Abhishek Dayal, Director of Project Management. So Harry covered a lot of ground on some of the funding requests that we've made. The RAISE grant for the fiscal year 22 program, we submitted this application with fingers crossed last night. We asked for $20 million for our Clearwater multimodal project. That's the total cost for that project was $34.4 million, and we're requesting $20 million. As Harry noted, we had a really good debrief on our previous year's application. In fact, they also told us that the application made all the way to the Secretary's desk for final review, and that's where we were sort of weeded out. So based on the feedback that we got from the debrief, we really did a lot of detailed work on the benefit cost analysis. In fact, we took a more conservative approach for the benefit cost analysis to make sure it was defensible and we have a solid application, which we believe we do. So we're looking forward to a very successful review from this RAISE program, and we look forward to the outcome from this year. We've already submitted one earmark request through the community project funding request for the appropriations with Congressman Bilirakis. We asked for $500,000 for the charging infrastructure up in Tarpon Springs. And then for Congressman Chris' request, we are putting in a request for $2.5 million for the battery storage for all the solar infrastructure that I had mentioned to the board before in a couple of months about our partnership with Duke. So that's going to support that infrastructure program. So that's in the process, and we're working with Harry to get that turned in today.
Hey,
I was
Brad,
thinking that-
just for context on the RAISE grant, part of what we heard in the presentation, I believe, Abhishek, there were 900 applications for RAISE grant projects in the last cycle, 90 were funded. So that was a $1 billion pot, they funded 90, so if you just conceptualize, think about, this pot will be $3.5 billion. So you can see how many more, and the cap, it remains at $25 million on the amount you can request. So you can see how many more projects that we'll be able to fund in this cycle. So I think, you are in really good shape, and I think with your meeting in May, you can help solidify that. So, as you say, fingers crossed, but that gives you an idea how many more. And they also, in the previous cycle, there was a limit of 2 per state. So no state could get more than 2 grants in the last cycle. That limit's removed with the excess, substantially more funding out. So there's no limit of how many you can have per state. There is a requirement that there be a split between rural and urban, but there is no limit. I don't think I have a check on the number per state.
There was a limit on 2 per state, and Tampa got the 2?
Well, there was a limit to, one of them was considered, they actually got 3, Florida got 3, but one was considered rural, so.
Oh.
So they allow them to, I guess somehow they bypass the 2 per state if one's rural, so.
So like 2 urban per state?
Correct.
maybe, Or
Right.
something.
Well, I think what you said about clearing up where Clearwater is,
Yeah.
I don't think they really knew where Clearwater was, somewhere in the panhandle or something,
I think
you know?
Brad did a very effective job on that, as
We
did
have
Commissioner
one page that
Flowers.
says, "We are not Tampa."
So, and I think the staff, both for the Department of Transportation and FTA, I think really got the message on that. And as did, I think, during the debrief too, we talked about that with the technical staff that reviewed the application, so.
We actually put it in the application also, that, we're not Tampa, we're on the other side of the bay, so that's included in the application, just to make it clear that where we are.
So one of my things I took away from the phone call I was on last year with the US DOT was regionality. I mean, that seemed like a very important thing. Did we address that better this time?
Yes, we did add a lot of letters of support from, regional organizations. TBARDA provided letters of support. Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council provided letters of support. So all of those, we've combined those to really hone in the point that this is a facility of regional importance, and so it should be funded.
Good.
Mayor Welch sent a letter today.
Good,
For it.
excellent.
And the staff was happy to hear that the state's supporting the project with funding, that the city is supporting the project, that you have your own funds invested in the project, so they were, I think, happy. We discussed that's why you went to $20 million, I think, based on that conversation with the technical staff who reviewed it, so I think they were pleased that there are a lot of partners in this project too, so.
On the community or earmark programs, I don't know the potential of Congress to actually go along with these presidential suggestions for these new pots of funding, but this one about climate resilience adaptation that you talked about, the purchase and installation of batteries into PSTA's energy system is sort of, I would argue, a resilience program, because we can have the charging go on with solar panels, but it has to be connected to the grid, because the buses come here at night, generate the electricity, turn it into the grid, and then we take grid energy out at night. If we have the batteries, then if we're cut off by the grid because of a hurricane or something.
Speaking of resiliency, Brad, I want to commend Brad for one other innovative program too. Brad, a couple years ago, had worked with a company to look at an electric bus, being able to use electric bus to reverse power critical infrastructure, to take the electric bus and be able to use its power to support generators and other things. So Brad had been working that. We kind of did some demonstrations down here for that. And I sent to Brad the other day, the FTA just announced a competitive funding opportunity to look at that very subject, to take electric buses and come up with a program. I don't know if you saw that, Brad, or not.
How much money? I didn't see.
It wasn't very much. I think it was $5 million. It's a small program, but it's one I think that you all piloted here a couple years ago. So
Yeah.
it might be something to take a look at. But it just goes to the innovation here at PSTA, that some of the programs that you started on your own or are piloted on your own are actually now being picked up by the federal government. The one on mobility, the one here on using electric buses to power critical infrastructure. I think those things were piloted here in Pinellas County, which is great. So kudos to Brad and the staff here.
Yeah. Last thing, on the appropriations, as Harry described, the bipartisan infrastructure bill does also substantially increase the formula funding that comes to the Tampa Bay region. And what happens is the federal government allocates funding by this complex formula to every urbanized area across the United States. And they list in the Federal Register Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater as the urbanized area. Any urbanized area that has more than one transit system or grantee, as designated recipient, as they call it, which we have 4 in the Tampa Bay. We have PSTA, Hart, Pasco County, and TBARDA. We have to mutually agree on what's called the split, to split up the funding, the formula funding that comes down to the Tampa Bay region in a certain way. And this has been going on since 1990s, I think. And it happens everywhere across the country. I guess the board over in Tampa at Hart has always questioned, has a lot of questions on how this all works. And so I think Debbie and her team is not necessarily supportive of this, but now, next Monday, I am going to the Hart Finance Committee to explain, going over to Tampa to talk to them about the process we use, in which we historically, and this is long before I got here, we allocate the funding to Pasco, T-BARTA, PSDA, and Hart in the way that it is earned in the formula. We use the exact same formula that the federal government uses to allocate it amongst ourselves. And that is roughly about 2/3 of all the cities in the United States do it the same way. They just take the formula, which the federal government publishes, and allocate it in the exact same way, which is a very considered quite fair way. There are a few examples of cities, urbanized areas, that do it in different ways. The most Hunger Games-like is the San Francisco Bay Area. Their MPO is all-powerful, and they have a MPO-led process every time the MPO votes on who gets the money. And they have like 16 transit systems or 25 or something, a huge number. So I'm not in favor of changing the formula. I don't think anyone is I don't think anyone is in favor of having some people get less and some people get more, necessarily. But I'm hopeful that maybe just explaining it to them, to the Hart commissioners, might make them feel more comfortable with it. Obviously, part of the formula is population, and population is based on this, the every 10-year census, and the population of Pinellas is not growing nearly as much as it is in Hillsborough, so they will soon start receiving even more money based on that, and with the increase amount, everyone is slated to receive more money than they have in the past. Debbie, you had something? Yeah.
Thank you, Brad. I was listening to this upstairs, and not everything on the back data has been published yet to determine how much we'll be getting, but to give you a rough estimate, for this coming year, based on the apportionment, we should be getting in total between 5337, 5339, and 5307 formula funds, $20.4 million. Now, to compare that to last year, it was 16.3 million, so it's about a 25% increase. And again, not all, that's an estimate, not all the back data has been published yet for us to do the apportionment between T-BARTA, Hart, and Pasco and us.
Not too bad.
No, I'm excited.
Yeah.
Hot off the press.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Harry. And we'll have a good we'll have a very successful visit to DC, where we'll drive it home once and for all. Yeah. Okay.
All right, I guess we got all answers, or questions answered and asked. Yes, Commissioner
I just
Albert.
have, I don't know, we can't really do any action items right now, but I just wanted to tell you that I did have a Zoom call yesterday with Via Mobility Solutions. I talked to you about that. They reached out to me, and I know that we interacted with them on a program, I think, for PSDA. And they were interested in possibly Clearwater. They're reaching out for any kind of mobility solutions. And so it was very interesting. I said, well, you know, right now, I really didn't have any interest. We have a new city manager, so forth, and let's get his legs under him first. But I'm thinking back still what Harry said about some of the programs that we're offering money, because they're an on-demand, pre-scheduled transit solution.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's something that, I don't know, that maybe, yeah, I don't know, I'm just bringing it out to you to say that it sounded very interesting, and I know that we've got that situation with paratransit and things, already in motion, but it doesn't necessarily have to be paratransit or,
No, and a number of our programs, like the program that Ron and I are working on submitting for the Commission for Transportation Disadvantage, is not for paratransit. It's for anybody. And there might be some opportunities for VIA to participate in some of those programs with us now. I mean, they were a bidder on our paratransit program, and they came in second or third, I can't remember. They didn't win, but there might be some opportunities. The challenge really for all these folks like VIA and Uber and Lyft is getting enough employees, or I guess they're not employees, getting drivers to drive for them.
they had, they offered two things. One was software.
Yeah.
If you had your own system, vehicles. And I said, well, how does that work? Well, some cities have vehicles that, that they own, that they could operate,
Yeah.
get people to bus stops, or they can, also supply the vehicles as well. So I just said that it was interesting to learn about them, just bringing it up because, at a later date, we could see how all this works, because it's all, it's multimodal now. There's so many opportunities of all different kinds of things, so.
Yeah. It's interesting.
It is. Well, I guess that would have fallen under other business.
Yeah.
Right, we're not allowed to take any action items or any votes. So I guess we're ready to adjourn.
I think we're
Right, we're ready for that, and right, we do, I guess, the next meeting is May 6th at 9 a.m. So hopefully everybody will tune in. This exciting meeting. Anyway, let's call it a day, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, and Jamie said that he did need to jump on that call. So he could be in the parking lot on a conference call.
All we had is just to approve the minutes. That was the only.
That was it.
action item.
And now we'll just wait till next month, I guess, we'll approve
Yeah, both.
those.
Yeah, I guess,
Well, I guess we'll be
our
having
chair,
minutes for this
Saraki,
meeting.
is out of town today.
Ah,
Oh, sounds like somebody just got here.